let me give you a bit of an overall picture of where we are. So if you take currently, if you take, let's say, the last 7 months, we've started seeing a decline in apparel exports. Our exports are primarily to the USA, the UK, and the EU. Those three markets account for around 85% of what we do. And we've seen, because we've seen it coming, obviously, because as orders, orders are placed well ahead. So it's something we've seen coming, that as those markets have gone into contraction for their own reasons, that therefore filters back into a reduction on demand for countries like ourselves. So I think the first one to kind of put out there is the fact that this is really not a domestic issue. This is an international issue that is affecting all apparel exporting countries. So to give you a bit of context, if you take apparel exports to the US, or if you look at it the other way, imports into the US of apparel, in the first quarter of this year, they were down by 20-something% compared to the same period last year. So that reduction is there from the global demand perspective. We're seeing similar issues in EU and the UK as well, for different reasons. The US is largely dependent on the fact that post-COVID there was a large increase in orders that were placed. So actually 2022 was the industry's best year in a long time. Right. So, and that really signified kind of buying that was caught up post-COVID. But I think what wasn't expected was a contraction in the economies there, particularly the US increase in interest rates, slowing of the economy, and that has meant that people just aren't buying the product. So therefore, the suppliers, the stores are holding large amounts of inventory, and therefore that has a knock-on effect. Right. So if you take the US again, as I said, whilst we see that 20%, and Sri Lanka's exports to the US are down by about 20%. The US is our single biggest market. It's about 40% of what we do. So it's a big piece. But that impact is happening right across the supply chain. So whether you're a Bangladesh, a Vietnam, a China, or a Cambodia, any of the apparel exporting countries into the US are all seeing declines, and those declines average out at about 20% because that's the way it falls. And Sri Lanka kind of sits right there. So I think that's the first one to put out, that this is kind of related to a factor that's completely outside of us. That does make it difficult to do something about, because if it's a reduction in exports due to either some policy locally or something, then we have the opportunity to take that up with the authorities and come up with solutions and to reason. So this one is one that's a little more difficult. Just taking that thought a little further, if you look at the EU and the UK, there our reductions are slightly smaller, but there you see a slight difference, because in those markets, countries particularly like Bangladesh are actually doing much better. Okay. Now the rationale for that is that, I mean, the European and UK and Europe economies are also going into recession. The fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war, the rise in inflation is, we were talking to one of the big brands and saying the issue is the customer just has less money in their wallet to purchase clothing, and therefore they have to buy clothing as cheap as they can, because price is king. And unfortunately with the UK and the EU, unlike Sri Lanka, Bangladesh's apparel exports, because they're an LDC and come under the everything but arms category, means that all of their products are duty-free into those markets. Right. Whereas Sri Lanka has, whether it's the EU's GSP Plus or the UK's DCTS schemes, have certain restrictions on rules of origin. And what that means is that into those markets, it's generally only about 50% of what we export that actually qualifies for duty-free status. So in that position, when the customer is looking to buy at the lower price, because they have to sell goods at a lower price, then the purchase price is vital, and therefore that's a landed price that's important, not an ex-factory price. Right. So when we don't have the duty concession, then we lose out. So in that sense, we're losing out in those markets a little bit more than we are. The US is seeing a fairly static reduction across all the countries. There are some odd variations, but essentially that's